This is going to step up a few levels kind of from where we've been. So I just kind of want to talk to everybody about the future of LCA. I feel like there's a lot of interesting things happening in our industry right now on this, and there's also like a long ways to go relative to where we need to get to. And just throw some ideas out. I'm curious to hear people's thoughts on it. So I was involved with Project Drawdown. For me, whenever I get kind of discouraged by climate change and just things in the news, this is like a place of hope. This idea that the point, when we start actually drawing greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere so that they stop climbing, and, working on that, it was amazing to kind of see like how possible that is. And when you see that something's possible, just changes your perspective on how to solve it. And as part of that, like a big idea within Drawdown is the idea of sinks. So this is a diagram many of you may have seen, but right now there's sources, right? So like you've got these major categories, and we kind of see buildings. Often in our industry, people categorize it as 25 to 40%, depending on reference point. Drawdown didn't draw the line around our industry the way we do. They drew it around the electricity sector. So buildings are kind of in there. They're also in industry. So it's just kind of like how the boundaries are drawn. But the big thing is, we have this, roughly 60% of our sources stay in the atmosphere, and the land sinks and ocean sinks are decreasing generally. And when you look at solutions, this diagram looks at, like the potential to shift things down. A few of the big takeaways that were surprising. One was refrigerants, which was the #1 solution. That's mostly because we do such a poor job at refrigerant management. Most of the chemicals that we create as refrigerants go to atmosphere globally right now. And there's a big effort to try to start phasing that out. But I've seen in our industry in the last 10 years, we've actually been going in the opposite direction, adding higher volumes of refrigerants into the building sector, which is going in the opposite direction. And then within industry, within the LCA, that kind of like falls into this material section. So it looks at it kind of quantitatively different, but the principles are the same with this idea of like sinks and sources. And when you look at timelines, like globally, the World Green Building Council, they're advancing this net zero whole life carbon emissions. So they want to hit net zero carbon operational emissions by 2030 and try to like reduce and compensate embodied carbon by 2030. And, it's kind of crazy if you think about how fast that's coming. It's about as much time from when I was involved with Drawdown, it goes by really quick. And this is an EIA study looking at like the share of zero carbon ready buildings that are supposed to be in the total building stock. Right now, like when I looked at this in Drawdown for net zero buildings, like we're a fraction of 1% globally. And this idea that, by 2050, over 85% of the building stock is supposed to be there is pretty hard to really get your head around. So the case study that Rachel shared, this is looking at like the full LCA. So the MEP part is the kind of darker green portion, and the rest of it you can see kind of broken out. We're trying to look at whole life carbon emissions. So kind of following that World Green Building Council methodology of how do you balance between all stages. And this is still very new. Like not many people are doing this. We don't see many clients asking for it. We don't feel like enough clients are really willing to pay for it. And I think kind of a call out to everybody on this call is like, how do we, as a group, encourage owners, our own teams to have scope to properly do this so that we're actually looking at all stages from not just A1 through 3, also looking at, 4 and 5, refrigerants under B1, how that fits into operational emissions, and end of life also is kind of like a key part of it. The language I find so cryptic too, like talking to clients around it. We have like all these codes, trying to like find better language. We find like the cradle to grave language is a little bit easier for clients to understand. So we kind of have this like translation key that we came up with to try to help people get it. But like the simplest way to think about it for me, and I was thinking about this last night, is like what we really want to do to hit drawdown is A plus B equals 0. And ideally, we set a timeline on that that's pretty short, like 15 years. On the Rocky Mountain Institute Innovation Center, we did one of our first LCAs, and we found that that was net positive enough with wood. It was hitting this point in about 15 years, but that's the only project I'm aware of that's done that, at least within our kind of projects. And it's pretty hard. There just aren't enough sinks right now to really balance the sources. And if you just look at, like, everybody looks at wood, and it's kind of like you balance the A stages, but we really need to balance A and the B stages together. And as part of that, it's like, how do you look at that? So there's kind of this fulcrum, right? Like, you go into debt with embodied carbon on a lot of projects because of concrete and other things. Like, how do we create that as actually more of a sink, so that we know how much do you have to be net positive to kind of balance that equation, and over what time period? And based on the climate targets of, trying to hit net zero carbon by 2050, that's kind of like the right timeline. So it's 15, 25 years max. In theory, we need to figure out how to balance this equation for projects. As part of that, like from a sink standpoint, we're trying to figure out, like, how do we find more sinks? And I feel like there's not enough out there. Wood, there's a lot of discussion around like how much of a sink it is based on sourcing. And I think we need to figure that out more. Concrete, there's an opportunity there with some kind of innovation, but also kind of more like, what else can we figure out as a sink into buildings? And also the landscape. So it's not just kind of looking at the construction, but like, how do we create regenerative landscapes that are actually carbon sinks as well? And the net positive part, like looking at time of use and kind of operational emissions, so that we're actually offsetting more than we use. And then end of life, the idea of kind of separating that out, when you quantify an LCA and you include it, like the embodied carbon with end of life, I find it often skews the results in ways that can be misleading. So something that we're trying to show is like this confidence benchmark. Like the end of life is so speculative, right? It's like you put an LCA that end of life is at 75 years or 50 years, but it's like, hopefully, most of the buildings we're working on last way longer than that. And we don't know. So when you include that as this definitive number, depending on the way that it scales, it can completely skew other stages of the LCA. And that upfront A plus B is, in the short term, really important. And it's just have to be careful not to let this kind of speculative scenario calculation skew the rest of it. So that's something we're trying to address and just like clearly demarcate for clients. And that circular economy part, we feel like is probably the biggest gap. The cradle to cradle products are something we're trying to help encourage. There's a big gap of cradle to cradle discussion. Cradle to cradle doesn't really fit in well with EPDs either. It's kind of a different, way of thinking about materiality. So it's like, how do we kind of marry up the EPD and cradle to cradle concepts so that we have better end of life reuse, remanufacturing, repurposing, and recycling. And with that, I will stop sharing and open up for discussion.